Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Teaching with Challenging Text by Dr. Timothy Shanahan. We're going to get started right away. We only have an hour today. I wanted to let you know that there are some patent publications related to this topic. One is Teaching Literacy in the Content Areas and Reading Comprehension More Than Just Strategies. These publications are available. These are available in the area where you have the vendors, as well as on the patent website. There is going to be a poster session that's occurring tomorrow from 11:45 to 12:30 in the Cocoa One and the Terrace. You want to really take advantage of that because you will have the opportunity to register to win 2 free nights here at the Hershey Lodge, and you don't have to be there to win. You just have to enter your email, and you will have the opportunity to win that. So that's something you want to check out tomorrow. So the vendors are in the exhibit hall today till 5 o'clock, but they will be available again tomorrow from 7:30 in the morning to 3:30 p.m. We do have the representatives from the Bureau of Special Education available till 5 today, and then also from 10 to 4 if you have some individual questions that you'd like to ask them. We are recording today, so you want to make sure all your personal devices are on silent, and if you need to make a phone call, please just take those outside and keep those sidebar conversations quiet today, especially because of our recording today. Tomorrow, Thursday morning, there's a breakfast in the exhibit hall starting at 7:30 in the morning. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker, Dr. Timothy Shanahan. He is Distinguished Professor of Education Emeritus at the University of Illinois at Chicago. He is a former Director of Reading of the Chicago Public Schools and past President of the International Literacy Association. Professor Shanahan served on the National Reading Panel and helped write the Common Core State Standards. He was elected to the Reading Hall of Fame in 2007 and is a former first grade teacher. He is the author of the popular www.shanahanonliteracy.com blog. So it's my honor and pleasure to introduce Dr. Timothy Shanahan.
Hey, good afternoon to you folks. I'm running out of voice. I've been doing this all day. I've got an hour to give about a 3-hour talk. So what I'm going to do, I think the best way to handle this is I'm going to pretty much divide this talk into 2. I'm going to give you, the first part of it is going to be about the research and the theory and all that kind of stuff, and the second part is going to be practice and practical. And they're going to be, if it works, they're going to be pretty balanced. It just has to be that way. And if you want slides, I post my slides on my website so you can have them. Okay. Let's just start with a real basic premise, and I don't want to go on and on with this because of the time. But the fact is, studies are showing us that students, when they leave high school, can't handle college or career or armed forces texts, and that the texts that they're asked to read are typically much harder than when in those first years beyond high school than the texts that they're asked to read in high school. So for example, there are studies that reveal things like, those really low kids that aren't going to go to college? The reading demands of those first jobs that they get are higher than the reading demands in high school honors English classes. So I'm not talking about, but our superstars, those kids are going to go to college. Yeah, and these kids in their first jobs are going to be asked to do things that are harder than that. What we're seeing is, if you look at things like the surveys of college professors that various groups do every few years, I was just looking at one that was done this last year, and it's something like 80% of people who teach college freshmen and sophomores say that the students aren't prepared to do college work. And the biggest fault that they see is inability to comprehend complicated texts. It's kind of interesting. One one of the things that your standards do, and I'll talk about this in a little bit of detail in a couple minutes, one of the things the standards that Pennsylvania is currently working under has done is to actually specify text levels that kids have to learn to read. And so, you're a third grader, you're supposed to be able to read texts that are at certain levels of difficulty. For an 8th grader, same thing. 12th grader, same thing. That's something we've never done before. We've always just specified skills that we wanted kids to learn, but we've stayed quiet about the standards of text. I mean, think about it like this. Let's imagine that your legislature, instead of putting reading standards in place, had decided to put weightlifting standards in place. And if you think about your legislature, this is possible. But let's say that they did this, and you can actually say that in any state in the union and get away with it. I imagine we'd write those weightlifting standards very similarly to how we wrote the reading ones. I mean, think about the reading standards you've had for years. They would say things like, kindergartners have to draw inferences. Third graders have to draw inferences. They're kind of repetitive. 9th graders have to draw inferences. I see lots of nods. You know what I'm talking about. Well, the standards then would maybe say something like, kindergartners have to do arm curls. And 3rd graders have to do arm curls. And 8th graders have to do arm curls. It's probably dawning on a few of you that I've been doing a remarkable number of arm curls from a man my age. Now, I understand the disrespect in that laughter. You're clearly not impressed with my arm curls. What's wrong with my arm curls? Besides, I've got a microphone, so I'm not doing it very well with my left arm. But why? What's wrong with my arm curls? No weight? If there was weight, I couldn't do this many. Are you crazy? Yeah, putting in actions, skills, exercises, without specifying how much weight is pretty meaningless. And so if we say, gee, readers have to be able to figure out a main idea, or readers have to be able to summarize a text, or readers have to be able to compare characters, or all those things that we put into our standards, well, how hard is the text? How heavy is the weight? Well, we don't have any weights on it. And what that means is, if you're teaching 4th graders the 4th grade skills, the ones that are in your standards, but you're doing that with 2nd grade books, you're not teaching the 4th grade standards. You're teaching the 2nd grade standards, because the weight is not just the exercise, it's the weight that matters. So doing those exercises with lighter weights isn't getting you there. And your standards for the very first time is asking you to teach kids to read particular levels of text. Now, what I've come to believe is by doing that, by making that requirement that no state had done until recently, is that it forces us to reconceptualize reading instruction. Instead of thinking of reading as just a list of skills that kids have to learn to accomplish, it now describes reading in terms of the level or the complexity of the text that you have to be able to negotiate. And of course, what that discourages is as much out-of-level teaching as we've done. What do we normally do with kids if the text is hard? We move them to easier text. Heck, you've been told to do that. Heck, the state has worked hard on that. Now, there is an exception in your standards, and I don't want to take a lot of time on it, but I want to mention it at least. The fact is, your state does not specify text complexity for beginning readers. It doesn't say you've got to use more complex text with kindergartners or 1st graders, but you do 2nd grade and up. And that's not a mistake. That was intentional. I'm seeing some school districts that are actually kind of screwing this up because they're trying to, these little kids have to get complex text because our standards say complex text, but they do for grades 2 through 12. What makes text complex, the feature that gives them the most trouble for beginning readers, isn't the vocabulary, isn't the grammar, isn't the text structure, isn't the content, isn't anything else that you consider to be something that complicates text. It's the decoding. And so if you start ramping up text difficulty on those kids, what you do is you make the decoding system less obvious. You make it more subtle. You make it harder to see patterns. And so instead of speeding kids along by going to complex text, you actually slow them down. Your state is not asking you to teach with more complex text when it comes to beginning reading, but they do from grades 2 on. And it's important that you know that. Just to give you an idea of what we're talking about here, you guys all know what Lexiles are, right? It's just a prediction formula. You know, it gives you a guess kind of how hard a particular text is. And so if you look at that middle column, what you see are the Lexile bands that Metametrics puts out. They're the people who publish Lexiles. And what they have figured out is if texts have certain characteristics say that measure between 450 Lexiles and 730 Lexiles, if the text has those features, it's usually understood by second and third graders with 75 to 90% comprehension. The average kids. Yeah, you'll have kids lower than that and so on. But the average second and third grader should be able to handle text in that range with 75 to 90% comprehension. How do they know that? Because they take tens of thousands of data from kids who are doing things like taking tests on passages, and they can tell you when the texts have those features, and those features that they use to predict are vocabulary and sentence complexity. And so, if it has those features, so it measures out like that, the kids tend to comprehend it like that. And that's true all the way down that middle column. All those are for that grade level, that's that 75 to 90%. And yes, they overlap because, they're not completely independent and so on. But then look at your standards that I misspelled. Isn't that delightful? I was hurrying. Look at the standards, what you're asked to teach kids. In Pennsylvania, for example, second and third graders are supposed to learn to read text between 420 and 820 Lexiles. What that tells me is even your average kids, if you're an average school district, even your average kids are not going to be able to read those texts with 75% comprehension. It's going to be lower than that because the texts are harder than that by design. That's what they're selecting. And if you follow it down, that's true at every grade level. And frankly, by the time kids are in 12th grade, you're asking them to read texts that are a year to 2 years harder than what they're reading now. They're not texts the kids are going to comprehend easily. And I know that's always true for your low kids. They don't comprehend the ones that are at grade level now in an easy. If a kid's a fourth grader and he's in a fourth grade textbook, your low kids are already struggling. Now your average kids get to struggle too. I mean, that's the kind of shift that it is. What do we usually do with kids when they are asked to read text like a textbook that they struggle with? And my observations lead me to believe that there are 4 common practices that really make up pretty much everything we do, almost everything we do. The first one I'm just going to mention because I want to talk about it more extensively in a moment, and that is the one you've been told to do. If a text is hard for the kids, move them to an easier text. That's the guided reading idea. That's the instructional level idea. That's the Goldilocks, where it's just right. You put the kid in that level. We'll talk about that one. But there are others. I mean, another popular one, especially in the primary grades, if the text is hard for my kids, I read it to them. I make sure that they get it. I can read those stories to them very well. I have a college education. And it's not just the primary grade teachers who do that. Upper grade teachers do it too, though sometimes they disguise it. Like I remember a middle school teacher, I'd gone and visited her class, and she told me she would never do this, just reading the text to the kids. And she didn't. What she did is she knew who the good readers in her class were. She had them read it to everybody. Teacher reading by proxy, I think they call that. Another one, especially popular as you move up the grades and in classes, science classes and social studies classes, is I have a textbook, but I just tell the kids all the important information. They don't have to read the textbook. It might be an option. They're allowed to read it, but they don't. because I know what's going to be on the test, and I can do PowerPoint every bit as well as Tim Shanahan can, and I'll tell you everything that is going to be on the test. And so you don't have to read your biology book. And that doesn't help kids reading at all. And the fourth one is the old-fashioned way. You just ignore the problem. You know, you assign text. You don't worry about whether the kids can understand it or not. You ask questions, and you call on Statue of Liberty girl, you know, the one whose arm is always up in the harbor. And you move on. And, you know, the fact that a bunch of the kids didn't get it isn't your problem. You're a teacher. You know, it's just too bad. Your laughter suggests to me that you recognize that none of these four methods are going to teach kids to read the text that we're being asked to teach kids to read. That's the problem. So I want to turn to this whole issue of moving kids to the easier text, because this is the one, frankly, that over the years, at different times, your state has endorsed. It's the one that if you have a degree in education, had to take any reading courses, this is the one, pretty much any place you went, you were taught you had to teach kids at instructional level. There's nobody in this room old enough to have been trained before we started telling everybody this. The claim has been that you had to teach kids at their instructional level for them to learn. And I could take you through lists. In fact, on my website, if you look at the versions of this talk, the longer versions of it, I've got lists of all these International Reading Association presidents and Reading Hall of Fame members and all these different things, all of whom have written that it's so critical that you put kids at their instructional level. Are there any special educators in the room? You know, a lot of times, yeah, there should be. A lot of times, the reading people and the special education people argue over stuff. Not on this one. This is one where there's big agreement. You got to teach kids at their level. We did a survey a few years ago. In fact, when your state was first adopting the new standards, we wanted to see about teachers' instructional practices. And so we asked teachers how they selected the material that they used to teach reading. This was 4th grade through 10th grade teachers, ELA teachers. And we, one of the questions was, how do you select the material for reading? And it's multiple choice. Do you do it by grade level? You know, so if a kid's a 5th grader, he reads 5th grade book. Do you do it by reading level? You know, I test the kids' reading and then I find a book that matches. Do you do it by interest? Do you do it by skill? Do you have some combination of those that you use? Do you have your own scheme? You know, please fill in the blank. 64% of the upper elementary teachers said that they always teach kids at their instructional level, that that's what they strive to do. They might not all do that. They might not be effective, but they know that's the right answer anyway. But it's more than a third of the middle school teachers, too, and actually a quarter of the high school English teachers, all claiming that they teach kids at instructional level and ignore grade level altogether. And your standards are saying, you can't get away with that now. You can't do that. Do you know where the instructional level idea came from? I don't think I must have lifted it out of here, so I'll just quickly tell you. It actually comes out of Pennsylvania. It was a professor at, part of the time he was at Temple, and then later he was at University of Pennsylvania. So we can blame it on that half of the state. Back in the 1940s, so this isn't something recent. Back in the 1940s, 70 years ago, he wrote a textbook, a guy named Emmett Betts. I don't know if you've ever heard the name. And he's cited both by the special educators and the reading educators as the source of this. He published a textbook in 1946. This is where that whole idea that everybody has 3 reading levels came from. We have an independent reading level, that is those texts that you can read without any support and you can learn from it. An instructional level where there's going to be, you're not going to know all the words, you're not going to be able to get all the ideas yourself, and with the guidance of a teacher, you're going to be able to comprehend it. And a frustration level where, frankly, it's just too hard. Even with a skilled teacher, you can't make real progress. He's the one who said the way you figure this out is giving kids, well, in those days, an informal reading inventory. Now you might call it a running record, but you'd have kids read graded passages and you'd evaluate that. He was the one who set the criteria that most people have used or that they've generalized off of, essentially saying that an instructional level meant that the student, if they read the text aloud, would read it with 95 to 98% accuracy. That is, if you gave them 100-word passages, they'd make no more than 5 mistakes in oral reading. And if you asked them questions, they could answer 75 to 89% of the questions. You know, why did Lexiles focus on the levels that kids can read with 75 to 89%? Because that's the instructional level. There are go to see the vendors. There are literally dozens of instructional programs, both for regular classroom use and for use in special education, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 interventions and programs. Many of them, most of them, all set up around this idea of teaching kids at their instructional level. So this is not a small idea. This isn't something that a few quacks have been doing. This is something that we've been training in for a long time. Now, when Betts put this into his textbook, one of the things he said is that one of his students had conducted a study during World War II that showed that, in fact, if you put kids, you taught them at their instructional level, they made more progress than if you taught them at the frustration or the independent level. And so it's research-based, right? Would it bother any of you to know that that study wasn't done? I mean, they did a study, but not of that. They never tried it. Their study was this. They tested a group of 4th graders with an informal reading inventory. That's the whole intervention. They tested a small group of kids. And what they were interested in, later on they couldn't remember where they got this, but that 75 to 89% for comprehension was something that they decided that was an instructional level, even though they didn't have any reason for believing that. Later on, when they were questioned on it, they just said, I don't know, it must have been something we used in our clinic, don't know where that came from. And what they looked for when they had the kids do the oral reading is they were trying to find how many mistakes do kids make and still be able to answer 75 to 89% of the questions. Since we know that kids learn best if they're taught with text at that level, then we just have to find the oral reading that matches to it. They never tried it. They never tried teaching some kids with it to see if it gave any, and we started telling all of us to do it. And I want to make this very clear so that this isn't me pointing my fingers at all of you and going, boy, are you people dumb? Because I was a classroom teacher, and I can tell you every single year I taught, I tested every boy and girl I worked with one-on-one with an informal reading inventory, and I matched kids to books using those criteria, and I had multiple reading groups. Now, we didn't have all the little books in those days, so I had multiple basal series so that I could pull different levels of books and match them up, for the different groups and so on. But I taught that way, and I believed that that was part of why people thought I was a good teacher. And when I first found out that study wasn't done, when I went back and read that doctoral dissertation that he was referring to and saw that all they'd done was tested a group of kids and never tried it, I wrote about it, I published about that 30 years ago, but I didn't know what to do with it. Okay, so now those criteria are incorrect. They're just made up. We don't have any validation of them. We don't know if teaching... What do I tell people? And so I just I wrote about it, but I kept my mouth shut. There have been some studies done more recently that we have to go on. Clearly, the Betts-Kilgallen study isn't going to get us there. Well, let me just, how many more minutes? Oh, I got 5 more minutes of the first half. Or 6 more minutes. I'm going to take you through all the research on this. It's not a huge body of research, so I'm going to take you through all of it. There's a series of studies done in the 60s, 70s, and 80s by a fellow named William Powell, who was at the University of Florida. Powell didn't test he believed in the instructional level. He just didn't think Betts had gotten it right. He thought that his approach was correct. He thought you just had to match up the oral reading rates with, the oral reading performance with the comprehension, and you'd have an instructional level. So he did something crazy. He went and collected a bunch of data on more kids than Betts had looked at, and at not just fourth grade, but at first, second, third, all the way through eighth grade. So, he actually looked, and he learned two things that I think are interesting. A little misleading perhaps, but interesting. One of the things he found was he didn't find a consistent pattern of how oral reading matched up with comprehension. At some grade levels, kids could tolerate a lot more disfluency and still comprehend a lot. And so he concluded that different grade levels had different instructional levels. And the other thing that stood out is that, in fact, the instructional levels he was coming up with was putting kids in much harder books because, like I say, kids could tolerate more disfluency than Betts was predicting. And so he came up with a different set of standards. And it wasn't a single set of criteria. It was, well, if you're doing second grade, you match it this way. And if you do fourth grade, you match it this way. Powell was always written about in our field as a kook. And the reason he was a kook is because he got the wrong numbers. He didn't have the right criterion. We knew the right criterion were the ones Betts did with that small group of fourth graders, not the ones he came up with, the much larger groups of first through eighth graders. Isn't that interesting? Went to his grave thinking he was a kook. Dunkeld, 1970. Dunkeld actually was a student of Powell. And he did something crazy. He went out and started observing in second grades. He tested the kids to find out what their reading levels were. That is, how they matched to the books that the teachers were using for instruction. And then tried to figure out which kids learned the most in the year by testing them at the beginning and the end of the year. So what we want to know is which book matches lead to the greatest learning. And he came up with book matches that were much more in line with what Powell was saying, that he was finding, for example, second graders seemed to be learning the most when the kids were only able to recognize like 85% of the words. Well, that's much harder than what we've been teaching. But that was what he found when he actually looked at real kids in real classrooms. And that's just always been ignored. Another study, a correlational study again, done by Jorgensen. He took boys in third, fourth, and fifth grade, tested them, found out what their instructional levels were, and then monitored how the teacher, so let's say I test you and I find you're at a third grade reading level. Your teacher has you in a fourth grade book. You're on a third grade reading level. You're in a third grade book, and so on. And then what he does at the end of the year, again, looking at how much learning the kids do, he wanted to see what the correlation was with the degree of match. The idea being, boy, the more you're close to your instructional level, the more learning that should be going on. What he found? No relationship. Didn't matter how kids were matched to the books. It didn't matter if they were at frustration or they learned about the same amount. There was nothing predictive in it at all. Kind of interesting. Oh, finally, 2000. 54 years after we start telling teachers they have to do this in their classrooms, if they're good teachers, somebody decides, let's try this out. Alyssa Morgan and her colleagues run an experimental study where you actually intentionally place kids at different levels to see what happens. She tests a bunch of second graders with an informal reading inventory. She finds out their instructional levels using Betts criteria, just the same ones we've usually used. She randomly assigns the kids to one of three treatment groups. So you guys over here will be treatment group 1. We're going to teach you at your instructional level. So if you read at a second grade level, you get to be in a second grade book. You read at a first grade level, you get to be in a first grade book. You guys in the middle, remember, random assignment, you're just like them. We're going to put you 2 grade levels above your instructional level. So you read at a second grade level, you're going to work in a fourth grade book. You guys over here, we're going to put you 4 grade levels above your instructional level. We'll put you in a 6th grade book. You know how this is supposed to work, right? Guys along the wall here are going to make the biggest gains because you're at your instructional level. You guys are going to probably learn something, but not as much of them because you're in harder stuff. These guys are going to burn the school down. It'll be like reading hieroglyphics. It'll be so hard for them, they won't be able to do it. It's going to be terrible. They do this for a school year. They come back. They test everybody. You'll be pleased to know all the groups make some gains. You guys who were so perfectly placed made the smallest learning gains of the groups. The smallest learning gains. The least progress. You guys outperform them on the post-test by almost a full school year. And you guys who I said were going to be a disaster, you didn't do as well as that middle group. You were about halfway in between the groups. A little closer to the middle one than to the... They didn't tell you about that one in graduate school, did they? Well done study, published in a good place. This next one, Renata O'Connor. Some of you know Renata's work. She's a special educator. Renata is a very careful researcher. Her studies aren't done with regular classroom kids. She was working with learning disabled kids. All these kids had IEPs in her study. In the first study, the 2002 version, she took learning disabled kids, 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade level. She tested them. She reports that the best readers in the sample were reading at a beginning 2nd grade level. So obviously, if that's the high watermark, everybody's someplace below that. She sets up a tutoring plan, and you'll never believe what she tutors. Has the kids tutored in phonemic awareness, phonics, vocabulary, fluency, reading comprehension. I don't know how she came up with that, but that's, clearly very innovative. Again, random assignment. She tests all the kids. She finds out their levels. They're going to be 3 groups. One's a control group. They're not going to get any tutoring. They're just going to do their regular classwork. That way we're going to know whether the tutoring's working, right? You guys, you're going to get tutored in reading level stuff. So we're going to match you to the books the way we've told you to do. You guys, you're just going to work with your grade level books. So you're a 5th grader, you're working the 5th grade book. Yeah, but he reads like a 1st grader. You're going to work in the 5th grade book. In your group, man, he's a 5th grader, but he reads like a 2nd grader. He's going to be in a 2nd grade book. That's the difference in the instruction. She gets a different result than the one I told you with Morgan. She gets a different result. First of all, both tutoring groups do better than the control group. So the tutoring's working. Kids are learning. They're making better progress. But unlike the Morgan study, the kids in this case, these IEP kids placed at their reading level, made bigger gains. They made bigger gains in word recognition, bigger gains in word analysis, bigger gains in fluency. I don't think there was a comprehension difference, but in all those important foundational skills, the reading level seemed to be facilitative. 2 things I want to point out, though, because this one gets cited a lot. They ignore these other studies, but they pay a lot of attention to this because it supports what they want to believe. One of the things I would point out to you is, remember, she said that the best readers in the study were reading at beginning 2nd grade level. One of the analyses that she did is she went back and actually looked at her data, something we always tell researchers to do, but they rarely do. But she did it. She went back and looked. And one of the things she concluded was the gains, the advantage that was coming to being at the instructional level was coming for the bottom half of the distribution. The better reading kids at the beginning didn't seem to differ that much, but the kids at the bottom, that's where the distinction was. Who's asking you to teach beginning readers with more complex text? Nobody. So you could just say her study is irrelevant. Let's not say that. Let's just hold for a moment. A second thing that's important to know is she followed the study up. She went and replicated it. And it's the replication that's actually interesting and that nobody likes to cite. What she did is she went back, she redoes the study. And the reason she redoes the study, again, very careful researcher, she noticed something in the delivery of the tutoring. Kids make reading mistakes, right? They're reading the text and they miscall words or don't know words. And she saw teachers, remember this is all individual teachers doing the tutoring. She saw different patterns of response. Like, for example, Sean here, kid makes a reading mistake. He makes him sound it out. Laura tells the kids just to guess. You tell them skip it. You tell them the word. Everyone had their own game. And she thought she was worried the differences in how they were guiding the kids with the words might be having an impact on the outcome. So she goes back and replicates the study. The big difference being this time she's going to train everybody to respond to reading mistakes in the same way. So now that's equalized across the groups. She reruns the study. She finds absolutely no difference in performance for those kids, whether they were taught at their grade level or whether they were taught at their instructional level. Remember, those are learning disabled kids. I shared that with a group of learning disabled kids in Ohio a few months ago. They cheered. They said, "Are you saying we don't have to work in the stupid books?" Their mothers cried watching their kids that excited about the idea that they could actually work with grade level materials and make the same gains that they were making. For some reason, O'Connor, same research team, same study, except one being a replication, same journal. One is cited a lot so that you know that reading level matters, and the one where she proved that it didn't, they don't cite. Final one, again, is a series of studies done by Melanie Kuhn and Steve Stahl and their colleagues, where they used their fluency-oriented reading instruction initially with second graders, where with fluency-oriented reading instruction, their scheme, you teach kids with grade-level materials, and they compared their classes with guided reading, where you try to place everybody at their reading levels. At the end of the first year, and it was supposed to be a one-year study, at the end of the first year, their kids were outperforming the guided reading kids by almost a full year. And this was a large study, like 14 school districts, big. They were outperforming the kids by almost an entire school year. In fact, it was going so well that the teachers in the 4A schools asked them if they would continue the study another year. So they followed them through the end of third grade, and they continued to increase their advantage over those kids. What I'm telling you, folks, is that there are no studies supporting the idea of teaching kids at their instructional level. It's made up. There's just no evidence behind it. How could I let that dominate my teaching? How is this even possible? And let me explain. The basic theory was this, right? There are two variables that matter here. How hard the text is, how well the kid can read. You bring those into the right stasis, you're going to get learning. Isn't that what we told you? Powell, in trying to explain his theory that the kids needed to be in harder text, had to explain that. And his explanation was this. He said it's not a two-variable problem. It's a three-variable problem. Yes, it matters how hard the text is. And yes, it matters how well the youngster can read. But there's a third piece of the puzzle. Now, he was a Vygotsky guy, so he used terms like mediation and mediator. I'm not, so I'll say teacher. There's a teacher. These kids aren't just out there trying to teach themselves to read. We're trying to teach them to read. We don't know what went on in those Morgan classrooms. But my bet is those kids who are placed at their instructional level very rarely raise their hands with a question for the teacher. And very rarely had to reread a text. But I bet these were teaching nightmares. There were kids all over the room with hands up. What's this word? Can you help me with this? What does this mean? Well, read that again. Why didn't you try it a third time? Your state is essentially saying, we don't care if you can get kids to higher levels. Is there any evidence suggesting that Powell could be right? Because, of course, the studies that we have, they're very careful about measuring the kids. They're very careful about measuring the books. They don't measure the amount of teaching. They don't measure how much scaffolding or support kids get. Is there any direct evidence showing that you can scaffold kids, say, to an instructional level? And in fact, it turns out there's a lot of research. See that list? Every one of those studies has intentionally placed children at frustration levels. And they're different by study. So it might be in one study, the kids were at 85% accuracy and 50% or lower comprehension. In another study, it might be 80% and 50%, that kind of thing. So they vary a bit. But every one of those studies literally placed children in frustration level materials and then added some scaffold, something that the teacher would do, something the teacher would tell kids or show kids or help them with. And the kids would read the text as if the text were at their instructional level, even though they were frustration level. Every one of those studies did. Oh, and these two. I found 24 studies like that. Simplest example that I can give you of a scaffold. Pre-teaching vocabulary. Right? I've got you in a text that I know is too hard for you because I've been testing you on this for the last 2 weeks, and when you read text this hard, you make 15 mistakes every 100 words, and you can't answer even half my questions. She's at a frustration level with this. But now I'm going to pre-teach vocabulary for text like that. I'm going to artificially make you more like the text. This author uses certain words. I'm going to make sure you know some of those words. I'm going to bring you more in line with the text in terms of the vocabulary, and then I ask you to read it, and you read it with 95% accuracy, and you can answer more of the questions and so on. Hey, that's pretty cool. And there are many other scaffolds. That's, in fact, many of these studies study more than one. Some only study one, some study 2, 3, 4 different ones. My point is that this idea of putting kids at their instructional level has a lot of problems. One of the problems is it doesn't give kids an advantage. Why are we working so hard at doing something that isn't actually helping kids? A second one is in some ways we might be hurting kids. Because I believe that the difficulty of the text, the fact that this text demands that you be able to do things you don't know how to do, gives you opportunity to learn. There's something there for you to develop with, and that's important. But I would also argue, especially for special education kids, they spend so much of their time working in materials that might be at their, what we've called a reading level, but aren't at their intellectual level, aren't at their interest level, aren't at standards levels for math or science or social studies or any of the other things we claim we care about. They make them feel stupid, those kids I was talking to. Gee, we don't get to read the same books that everybody else is. We get to read what the second graders read. Why? Because you can recognize 95% of the words there. But somebody could scaffold me and make it possible for me to handle the same books that they're handling. So we've been doing something with the claim that it's instructional level, that it's research-based, but it really isn't. In fact, I'm just looking at what one of the publishers was promoting. In fact, Nell Duke, some of you know Nell Duke's work. Nell sent me some ad copy from a publisher and saying, is this correct? Is there research behind this? And I looked, and it was all like people's opinions. Oh, it's really important that you teach kids at their instructional level. They didn't have any data. They hadn't tried anything. They were just, oh yeah, this is what you should do. And there was no research in it at all. It was just talk. So the question, and now the rest of our day, is how would we scaffold kids with challenging text? And you can see why we could, I could tell you a lot more details about everything I've talked about, so we could spend more time on what we've done. But I could also spend all the rest of the day just showing you scaffolds. I'll show you a few. We only have time for a few. But there are a bunch, and these aren't all the possible scaffolds. In fact, let me just lay out one last little theoretical notion. Anything that an author can put into a text, whether we're talking about vocabulary, whether we're talking about literary devices, whether we're talking about language choices of various kinds, whether we're talking about complex syntax, anything they can put in can help somebody to understand an idea better, right? Can convey an idea in a powerful way. But every feature that they can manipulate like that is going to be not only a support for some of you, it's going to be a barrier for somebody else. So if you have an author who uses just the most precise vocabulary, so they give the most exacting descriptions of something, understand that could give you a really clear idea of it because they have such precise vocabulary. And there's some other reader who's going, I don't know what he's talking about because he's using words I don't know. And that's true of every single feature. Well, what if you format it like this with bullet points? Won't it be clearer? For everyone who can read bullet points, yes. But if you don't understand that structure or what you're doing there, no. So everything is a potential barrier. Every feature is a potential barrier, and we have to start to be more alive to them. I'd like to start with one. I'll start with vocabulary, because it's the easiest to understand. It's the one you're all doing already badly. This is one I don't think we do well, so I'm going to try to improve your practice. I'm not going to try to change it. The most obvious problem in reading a text is you don't know the words. Author uses words you don't know. If you go look at the programs that the vendors have, I don't care which programs you look at, any of them that do reading comprehension are going to have some kind of pre-teaching of vocabulary. And I don't know what's in the hall because I didn't go there. If they have science books will have pre-teaching of vocabulary. If they have social studies books, health books, music books, they'll all have pre-teaching of vocabulary. Math, everything. And if they're not just K-12, if they include the community colleges and stuff, guess what? They pre-teach vocabulary. And if you go online and look at the lesson plans that teachers post, either the ones they put up for free or the ones they sell, guess what? They put in the vocabulary. Here's the words you got to teach the kids to do this lesson. I mean, so everybody buys this. This isn't like, oh God, Tim's coming up with something. There are these studies showing that it actually works. That if you pre-teach vocabulary, you raise the kids' ability to handle the text. And that's all we're trying to do. But look at these examples. This is a 4th grade example. Photosynthesis may sound like a big word, but it's actually pretty simple. You can divide it into 2 parts. Photo is the Greek word for light. Synthesis is the Greek word for putting together, which explains what photosynthesis is. It's using light to put things together. You may have noticed that all animals and humans eat food, but plants do. And it goes on to explain how photosynthesis allows plants to turn light into food. Guess what word the publisher wants you to pre-teach? You got it. It's the one word I would say you can't pre-teach for this. That's a silly word to pick. Why is it a silly word to pick? Because that's what the text is going to explain. In fact, that's true of most science materials. They're going to explain concepts to you. If I tell you what all the concepts are ahead of time, why read it? Only an idiot would read it. It's not worth reading. I'd be better off rehearsing so that when we're done reading and you ask me what photosynthesis is, I can remember what you told me before I read it. This is crazy. It's a bad choice. It's supposed to help, but what it does is it takes away any need to read. Photosynthesis is a great comprehension question here. At the end of the reading, what is photosynthesis? But pre-teaching photosynthesis, any word that the author's going to explain is a stupid word to pre-teach. Bad choice. Or look at this example. Some scientists argue that these gases have heated up our atmosphere. They say global warming will affect our climate so dramatically that glaciers will melt, sea levels will rise. In addition, it's not just our atmosphere that can be polluted. Oil from spills often seeps into the ocean. And I've highlighted 3 words, and none of those are defined here, so they all seem like fair game. But my question to you is, are there any that you think your kids could figure out from context? What do you think? You think glaciers they're going to get. Why do you think they'll get glaciers? So they melt, they raise. Fair enough. So you think and it's a guess. You could be wrong. But it's a guess. And I give you, I bless you, I'll give you the right to be wrong. Nothing wrong with that. I'm wrong frequently. And of course, we'll just change it up a little bit. But my suggestion is here, if you believe, you didn't pick effect, so I don't think they're going to get effect ahead of time. So I'm willing to pre-teach that one. I'll tell them that word ahead of time. But I'm not willing to teach them glaciers because I think they can get glaciers. If they can get it, why are we pre-teaching it? Why are we giving help when the kids don't need it and not giving it when they do? So, do you guys know what mansplaining is? This is one of those things my wife, some of you do. My wife raises this with me. This has never happened to any of you ladies, right? You've never had men explain things to you that you've known since you were 9 or whatever? This is sort of the same deal, but with kids. I know you know this, or I know you can figure this out, but I'm going to tell you anyway, so you don't have to. That doesn't help the kid to make sense of the text. It's irrelevant. If anything, it makes you not read the text. So again, I would say, Don't pre-teach a word that you think there's a strong enough context, or I could say, or morphology that you think the kid should know, that you think they can figure the word. If they can figure it out, it's a comprehension question. If they can't figure it out, it's perfectly reasonable to choose to pre-teach that. I'm going to skip this example. It's a cool example, but I'm going to skip it. Yeah, that's why. Focus on words that make a difference in comprehending text. Do not pre-teach words that are explicitly defined. Do not pre-teach words that can be figured out from context or morphology. And at one point on there that I didn't talk about, and let me just mention it. You do not, when I say pre-teach, I hate the term actually when it comes to vocabulary. Because it's not, you don't have to spend 45 minutes pre-teaching vocabulary. It's, boys and girls, glacier is like a big wall of ice. Right? Seeps just means that the oil seeps from the land, it runs from the land into the water. Boom. We're not going to go crazy with this. We're not going to do this all day. I watch these classes where they're pre-teaching vocabulary. It's not uncommon that pre-teaching vocabulary is a half hour or 45-minute part of the lesson. Yeah, you know what I'm talking about. We have videotapes of the children, even really young children. You should see the looks on their face. Oh, God, they look like they want to die. I'm going to suggest something. Either just tell the kids, there's some words here I thought you might not know. I want to just familiarize you with them before, and just tell them what they mean. Or if they're old enough, and 7 might be old enough in most cases, kids, there's some words here that I thought you might not know, so I put together a little glossary for you. Here's a handout, or I put it up on the whiteboard. You come to any of these words, here's the definition. If you have any others that you want to ask about, I'll help you. Boom. I'm done with pre-teaching a vocabulary. I just did it. So we're not talking about adding a half hour to every lesson. It might be a minute or two, right? That's it. Any of you read on an iPad or a Kindle or any of that stuff? Do you use that property where you can open up the dictionary just by touching the word? If I can look it up immediately, if I can get it without having to do any work, I look up a lot of words. If I can't, if I have to go look it up, it doesn't happen. It's the same thing with kids. Make it easy for them to get the meaning, and then you don't have to worry about it. Let me show you another example. Let's do one that you don't normally do. Sentence structure. Text can be hard because of the grammar. Text can be hard because how sentences are structured. I've got 2 examples here. Explain clearly using at least 3 different reasons or drawing 3 diagrams why McClellan lost the battle. Or explain clearly why McClellan lost the battle, give at least 3 reasons or draw 3 diagrams. Which of those is easier to understand? Most people find the second one easier. And I think you're right. But my question to you is this. The first one is in perfectly good English. Why aren't we teaching kids to read that one instead of just always dumping them back to the easy one? Here's an example that I pulled out of a 5th grade book. It's just one sentence that's embedded in an entire article. However, on August 24th, 2006, the International Astronomical Union, IAU, a group of individual astronomers and astronomical societies from around the world, made an announcement. It's 26 words long. It has 6 commas. It has parentheses. It has an acronym. It has numbers. My bet is most 5th graders will struggle with the sentence. I can be wrong too. This might, I'm making a prediction. Oops. How am I going to know if my prediction's right? I'm going to ask kids a question. So you read the text the way you normally read it. Well, we do it page by page in our class. Okay, then read it page by page, and at the end of this page, one of your questions might be something like, what did the IAU do? If the kids can answer it, this sentence wasn't as hard as I thought. If they start flipping pages or looking at their shoes or, then I was right. And now we need to go back to it and we need to do something with it. We need to figure, is there a verb in that sentence? Anyone find one? Made, yeah, the 24th word. Linguists tell us we interpret sentences from the verbs out. In normal conversation, we usually put verbs like the second or third word, and we keep our utterances to about 6 or 7 words in length to not overload memory. Here we have the kid has to read 24 words to find the verb. It doesn't work like conversational English. It doesn't even work like the English book where they might use more direct, punchier sentences. This is very much a science sentence. The question is, imagine this kid, here's a 10-year-old. He doesn't know he's looking for a verb, but he is, tacitly in his head to interpret it. And he's reading, however, on August 24th, 2006, the International Astronaut, to hell with it. He gives up. Or, even worse, he decides astronomical must be the verb. And then he's in big trouble too. So what are we going to do? Well, I might do with the kids just what I did with you. Maybe the first thing I'm going to ask them is, can you find a verb in this sentence? Let's see what we can do with that. Or maybe I'll break the sentence down for them. This picture gives you a little look of why the sentence is so hard. See the noun? That's the subject is the blue part. This is really typical science writing. The sentences are getting longer and longer, and the verbs are migrating further and further to the right. Why is that happening? Because one, they're using fewer adjectives because they find phrases are more precise and they want their science to be precise. So they use a lot of phrases to define, to modify the subject. So you get things like the International Astronomical Union, IAU, a group of individual astronomers and astronomical societies from around the world. That's, your subject. Or what about this? Intensive questioning of it. Who was the sentence about? Who are they? What did they do? What did they make? When did they... There's not one way to do this, but the point is guiding kids to make sense of the sentence without just telling them what it says or ignoring that they didn't get it. And I could show you some other sentences, but again, I'm almost out of time, so I want to give you a different... Let me just sum up what I wanted to say about the grammar, and that is, unlike vocabulary, I wouldn't pre-teach these sentences. I would identify, I would read the text before the kids. I'd identify sentences that had a lot of embedding, that were particularly long, that had funny placements of verbs, that, had dependent clauses or passive voice, and I would form questions about those, and essentially wait in the bushes for the kids to make a mistake so I could guide them to make sense of it. There's more. Another feature of language is cohesion. The killer whale tosses the penguin into the air, generally torments its prey before it eats it. The killer whale tosses the penguin into the air and generally torments the penguin before eating it. Which is harder, say for your second language kids? First one. Why? Having to make that connection. Texts are not lists of sentences. Texts cohere. All the parts have to connect. We do things like use pronouns, synonyms, repetition to link ideas across a text. This is a really lovely one, but I don't think I have the time to really take you through it. It uses the word it like 6 times to refer to 4 or 5 different concepts. And so, taking kids through that. I've got a couple easier examples. There were several roads nearby, but it did not take her long to find the one paved with yellow bricks. And the one I want to go after is one. What does one refer to? Roads. Are you sure? One sounds singular and roads sound plural. This gives second language kids the heebie-jeebies. In fact, you're right. You're not wrong about this because you're trying to select one of the roads. These indefinite pronouns like one and any are hard for kids. Or surely, said John, like one who had lost faith in his memory, he used not to sleep in the kennel. John, Wendy said falteringly, perhaps we don't remember the old life as well as we thought we did. And the question is, as well as we thought we did what? What's that referring to? It's kind of a weird construction. Any idea? That's right. Remembering the old life. Perhaps we don't remember the old life as well as we thought we did, as well as we thought we remembered the old life. I didn't know that Cheshire cats always grinned. In fact, I didn't know that cats could grin. They all can, said the Duchess, and most of them do. I don't know of any that do, Alice said very politely, feeling quite pleased to have got into a conversation. What about any? What does any refer to? The cats. Cheshire cats. Cats. They. M being dialect, them. That's cats again. I don't know any that do, the cats. There's another one up there that I didn't highlight, but it's even more complicated. What does conversation refer to? I don't know of any that do, Alice said very politely, feeling quite pleased to have got into a conversation. It's all the quotes, right? That whole list of, you got to make that connection. Teaching kids to do those things and asking questions that force them to think about those things are some of the kinds of examples of the kinds of supports you can give to kids to allow them to understand a complex text without you telling them what it says, without you reading the text to the kids. You enable them to handle harder and harder text. Last thing I want to say. With vocabulary, I can't think of a program in the country that doesn't at least spend a few minutes trying to teach kids to use context. I was pushing it for every day, but the fact is every program has a few worksheets and some skills lessons tied to that, right? I'm not crazy on that, right? You guys know I'm right on that. Why do we teach that? Why is that so important? So that when kids are in a situation where they're reading independently, where they don't have any support, and a test-in situation is one of those, right? I don't know this word, teacher. Too bad, you're on your own. We want kids, when they're reading a text, to try to figure out some of those words they don't know. When it comes to grammar, or cohesion, or tone, or structure, or any of these other features of language or content, it's an on-off switch. What do you do when you come to a sentence that you can't make sense of? Nothing to do, just don't understand it. What do you do when you come to a concept and you don't know what it's referring to or how to connect it back to anything? Well, you're on your own. We don't have anything to do with you. What I'm trying to suggest to you is what we need to teach our kids is not just how to read these specific texts, but in demonstrating to them how to do that and having them practice that with hard enough text that these are necessary to understand it. I think what you start to find is the kids don't have an on-off switch. It becomes, gee, I read that sentence and I couldn't make sense of it, so I broke it down. I know what to do with relative pronouns, or I know what to do with conjunctions, or I know what to do with punctuation. And when I broke it down, I could figure out kind of what it was saying, and so now I could understand that part of the text. Our kids don't know that stuff. We're not teaching it. Your state is giving you an opportunity, not just a demand on you, but an opportunity for you to teach kids things, and speech and language teachers and ELA teachers who know about language and about content are really going to be at a premium. Those are the folks that we're going to need to help us to make sure that we're giving kids really good supports. I've given you a few examples. If you want the slides, you can see some of the other ones. They're on my website. Thank you so much for being here today, but thank you for being here every day. Your work matters.
Okay, so our code today is A for apple, G for gorilla, H for horse, J for Jack, 27. AGH, 27. Thank you very much. We'll see you at breakfast tomorrow morning starting at 7:30.
Crazy way to do it. Not a